Thanks for joining us. My name is Ibrahim Sani. Very recently, the Malaysia Economic Monitor has been published for the October 2023 publication, talking about the current status of the economic situation or the current standing economically for the country. Here to discuss this and more is the representative to Malaysia and country manager for the World Bank Group, Dr. Yasuhiko Matsuda. Thanks for joining us, Yasuhiko. Let's talk a little bit more in terms of the top line findings from the MEM, and what would be some of the key highlights that you think is important for us to think about?
Okay, well, Ibrahim, thank you very much for inviting me for this interview, first of all. And indeed, we published our 28th edition of the Malaysia Economic Monitor, and this one is titled Raising the Tide, Lifting All Boats. And MEM, as we call it, has two parts. One is the macroeconomic update, and then the second part of the special topic. So this edition's special topic is about the role of fiscal policy instruments in reducing poverty and inequality. So the headline finding would be that Malaysia's fiscal policy tools do a reasonable job reducing poverty and inequality, but they can be more effective.
This is very consistent with your predecessors, actually, two predecessors ahead of you that talks about that, where we're on the right track, but it could be further enhanced in terms of widening the social safety net, for instance, talking more about pensions and trying to understand a little bit more about pension funds, trying to increase healthcare services to the poor and needy. These are long-standing issues that needs to be addressed, and of course we're looking at this budget being addressing these kind of issues. Do you feel that it's more pronounced these days following post-COVID, or do you feel that other issues needed to be attended first ahead of addressing poverty or widening the safety net base?
I see. So I think if you were in a policymaker's shoes, you can't be choosing, one issue over another, right?
Yes.
Everything does require attention, well, not everything, but multiple things at the same time. I would say though that this is one of the topics that would be worth attention, not for the short run only, but also for the long run. As you know, and people know better than I, Malaysia has been a remarkable example of reducing poverty and inequality while achieving high growth for a number of decades. But for the past decade or so, the pace of poverty and especially inequality reduction has slowed down, even before COVID. And COVID has, of course, worsened poverty and likely also worsened inequality. So I think it's more accentuated now, and it's good to arrest the sort of the pattern of stalled progress and continue to push the reduction forward.
Considering that our outlook for growth quarter on quarter will be moderated, we saw how we have kind of calmed down from the post-COVID growth, hyper-growth, from third quarter last year, or in fact second quarter of last year has come down now, and in a way it's gradually reached to a point where the government is expecting around 4.5 to 5.5 kind of growth, which is to a lot of degree kind of expected. Knowing that this is the case, where do you think the stimulus is going to be in terms of trying to help address poverty or raising the poverty, and on the back of a growth being moderated for the quarters to come?
Yeah, it's a tough balancing act, I suppose. Historically, much of poverty reduction and inequality reduction came from people earning more wages and income through structural transformation. I'm talking, decades ago, from moving from agriculture and low-wage mining kind of employment to modern manufacturing and services. And that structural transformation also has slowed down, right? And if you look at the proportion of workers in the medium skill rank, it hasn't moved very much for the last a decade or so. It's around, if I'm not mistaken, 60%, or a little bit below, are all in the medium skill level. High skill is below 30%, and the rest, of course, the low skill. And the wage gap between the medium skill and the high skill is significant, right? So in the long run, you need to change that structure, and the government, I think, has the focus in the right kinds of policies in terms of attracting more foreign investment of the high quality kind, and trying to push certain kinds of industrialization and manufacturing development through the new industrial master plan.
That's right. I was about to say that. So how are you looking at, or how does the World Bank look at with all these master plans in place, the new industrial master plan, the energy transition roadmap, and many of these overtures that the government has been announcing. The economic minister, Rafizi Ramli, was talking about 10 to 20 catalytic industries, new industries that could be created to allow for such just growth to be achieved. Is this a positive step towards the right direction in trying to so-called lift the boats right now?
I think so. I mean, in terms of the intent, whether all of the visions are attainable, remains to be seen, because, I have learned over the last 2 years of being here that there have always been good ideas, good policies. Challenge is implementation, right? Yeah. And I know that the government knows it, but the only way to know is to see the actual implementation. But in terms of the direction and intent, I think many of those ideas are, pointing in the right direction.
I like how the MEM for this publication is presenting the ideas, i.e., when you talk about raising the tide and lifting all the boats, the tide is described as the economy, the boats as the people, and lifting all the boats is on what it takes to support the people and rakyat. What would be some of the ideas that you can share with us that is contained within the MEM that is important for us to look at when we talk about what it takes to lift up the people or the rakyat?
Okay, so I know that this government is also concerned about equity, social justice, and the well-being of the rakyat, right? And there's a lot of discussion about this, in the context, for example, of the reform to the fuel subsidy or taxation. And there's an understandable concern, for example, that one of the main potential tools for taxation, GST, that it is regressive, What we are finding from the analysis we did for this MEM is that while understandable, focus on regressivity of any one fiscal policy tool, whether GST, PIT, may be misplaced. What matters is the overall impact of government spending and taxation on the distribution of income and well-being. So what we find, looking at other countries which have been more effective in using fiscal policy tools for reducing poverty and inequality, is that most of the impact comes from the spending side, not from the tax side. So the main reason why you tax the economy is not to redistribute income and wealth. It's to generate revenues that the government use for policy purposes, right? And typically, countries spend roughly similar proportion of their GDP on basic cost of running the government, like law and order, defense, and so on. Once you are able to collect more and more revenue, the proportion of the budget goes toward social spending also tends to go up. And that's where the poverty and inequality reducing impact comes from. So what is constraining Malaysia is actually the very low level of revenue. It's an outlier, in comparison to high-income economies for sure, in comparison to upper middle-income countries, or even to lower middle-income countries. So as long as you stay at the low revenue equilibrium, the government is never going to have enough resources to help the poor and the needy to the extent that they could. And so that's one big constraint that you face here, and that's something that government could consider.
Again, this problem identification has been quite a while. However, only very recently do I see the government of the day actually trying to take active measures in addressing this. Yes, of course, while GST could be regressive, it's still a form of consumption tax that is slightly better than a lot better than SST. But it's also important for us to discuss items like the progressive wage model or the progressive wage policy that has been approved by the Cabinet and the M10, where it looks at trying to introduce a way where we can upskill the B40 to another level. It has gotten a lot of positive feedback from the people and the workers. However, the implementation is still scant, at least in my opinion. The possibility of employers to adopt this is not mandatory. Therefore, it's very much looking at inducement way, maybe a government cross-subsidy of how this progressive wage model is going to be done, 50% by government, 50% by the employer, maybe, or whatever the mechanism may be. But isn't this a step in the right direction, where we look at progressive wage model to complement, say, for instance, the basic minimum wage requirements that the country already has, and of course with that also to scale it up slowly as well. Where do you feel the hesitancy is when it comes to, say, the employers, especially the SMEs, in terms of trying to improve on the well-being of their people versus trying to balance the growth of their own companies as well? Do you feel that this is going to be a big challenge for the government to execute? So
we know from data that there has been stagnation in the wage growth over a number of years. And the gap between the high skill and medium and low skill workers in terms of the wage levels has not narrowed. In fact, it has increased. Right? We're trying to look into these things as well, actually, and we haven't finished our work, so I don't have anything definitive to share based on the evidence and analysis. It's a puzzle for us. I heard the Minister Rafizi talk about the government's vision that eventually, by using progressive wage policy, they want to see a situation where the labor market works efficiently so that people with required talents are appropriately rewarded through the competitive labor market wage setting mechanism. And somehow the perception seems to be that this has not happened in the past. I don't know why this hasn't happened, but again, trying to move the needle in that direction in the labor market, I think is the right attempt. Whether this particular model and the particular policy will work depends on the details and implementation. I don't think it should become a subsidy scheme for the employers. And I heard on one of the radio interviews recently the private sector person saying that I think, if I recall, the subsidy element should be something like 75% of the wage increase to be given to the workers. That's just government giving workers cash transfer indirectly. That's not very efficient, right? So, I think that calibration is important, but at the same time, in the beginning, I think it's right for it to be voluntary. It has to be attractive enough for employers to subscribe to it, right? So I don't know where they're going to hit the balance in terms of the calibration of these parameters. But, it can be promising, but, unless the labor market begins to produce higher paying jobs, and that there is a way for companies to pay people, higher wages, because they are productive, that they are discharging functions that are needed in the economy, any government intervention is unlikely to be sustainable in the long run.
Which is why we need to talk about, say, for instance, the circular economy, hydrocarbon economy, the hydrogen blueprint that was announced, NIMP, as we alluded to earlier. These would allow for the job creation of higher skilled possibilities. But I don't know how we can execute that, considering that the money that is needed to get those industries up and running runs into the trillions over the 1 or 2 decades to come. Do you feel that investors are going to be allured by these kind of promises and grandeur, I guess, vision that the government has? Or it's going to be very much what we are seeing today in terms of the FDI flows or even some of the DDIs? It's still going to be about the same, despite these lofty ideals that have been presented by the government.
I think most people agree that the key constraint is the talent shortage, right? So one problem is, of course, workers in the current labor market not getting paid enough to sustain adequate living. And that does need to be addressed, and I understand that the progressive wage is a way to address that problem. But that alone does not solve the problem of talent shortage, right? And I'm struck by this statistic of skills-related underemployment.
Yeah.
There's a significant number of graduates coming out of universities and tertiary education institutions with a degree who are not employed at the level that they thought was
basically unemployed. And I think the number runs into, I think, 40% or 50%, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Youth underemployment, not necessarily unemployment.
So they're employed, but they're doing
in the wrong
lower level skills jobs, and therefore they're getting paid less than they otherwise would have been. And there, what we don't know is, if it's that they're just on jobs in the economy, or that there's potential demand, but the employers don't find the actual skills in these people, even though they have degrees. And that is also an empirical question. There's anecdotal And survey-based evidence suggests that employers are not always satisfied with skills that potential employees bring, and therefore maybe they're not opening positions that require certain skills. Then that's the low-level equilibrium, right? So you need to find a way to get out of that equilibrium, but it takes a while, for the talent to be produced. Striking statistic that we found from our own analysis of the education quality here is that the learning poverty, which is a concept that the World Bank came up with several years ago, it measures the ability of primary school students at, I think, a grade level 5, year 5, to read and do basic math at that level. And whether, what percentage of children can do this or cannot do this. 43% in Malaysia were unable to.
I'm sorry?
43.
So 43% is, I guess, undergoing learning poverty as defined by the World Bank.
Correct, yes.
What is the benchmark? What is the number for other countries?
Vietnam is in the tune of 20-something%, for example. So it's one of the better performers. Although, still, they have 20-some%, around 20% of children unable to perform at the level expected.
Which is what, 10 years old?
Roughly speaking, yes. 40 is not the worst, but it's not great. Yeah.
Sorry, it sounds like perplexing.
Yeah.
You're telling me 10-year-old, if I get 10-year-olds out there, 4 of them fail in a way, the learning poverty. In Malaysia?
Yes, that's what our data and analysis show. Yeah. So, there is a, deep reform of the education system that will produce, that will require a couple of decades at the earliest to show results, right? That does need to be started. But that's, for the long run effect of, poverty and inequality.
Yeah, of course, because I can see the trajectory of the economic growth as well.
Yes.
If you can't read and write at 10, or read and write sufficiently to a required status or level that you have deemed to be the level that is needed, the economic prosperity or the propensity for the economic prosperity is diminished over time.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So there are many indicators of inefficiency in the labor market and then talent pool, right? So it's the underemployment of people with certain degrees. Is it because of lack of jobs, or is it because their skills are actually not sufficient? Maybe a mix of both, right? But then if you keep looking more into the foundation of the system, you have the learning poverty and potential for investing more in preschool education, for example.
It is unstructured right now.
Yeah, Malaysia spent very little, at least public spending in preschool, and, the kindergarten and below, and that is shown by global evidence that it can have lasting impact on students' learning and potential as workers and well-informed citizens and all these things.
Circling back to what you said earlier, when you talk about some of the developed countries or economies, as the revenue increases, a lot more spending can go into social welfare programs or social programs. Do you feel that is being done a lot in Southeast Asian economies? Maybe Singapore would stand out, I suppose, but generally speaking, other economies might be in the same boat as we are. Is that a fair assumption to make when it comes to public spending, when it comes to social efforts?
By global comparison, countries in Southeast Asia have tended to be relatively sufficient with small states, so relatively low revenue collection, relatively low public spending, more dynamic market, regional integration and so on. So, Singapore also, they don't spend a huge amount, compared to, say, European countries, right? But that's so there is a regional pattern characteristic, if you will, that distinguishes Southeast Asia from some other parts of the world. Europe in particular, Latin America. Now, as Malaysia moves, toward the high-income status, the challenges that country face also changes, right? And if you want to address inequality, it's obvious that you can't just rely on market dynamics, and spending more on the right kinds of things is definitely one way to do, as demonstrated by other countries, including middle-income countries. Also in the short run, and this is a hotly debated topic, there's room to improve efficiency of public spending, because collecting more, but if your spending is inefficient, you're not going to get the bang for the buck, right? So the obvious one is the fuel subsidy. we ran some simulations to see what is the impact of fuel subsidy on reducing poverty, but also the fiscal cost.
And what is the result findings were?
Last year, Malaysia spent something like 2.9%, almost 3% of GDP on fuel subsidy.
Yeah,
right?
coming to a bill of about 60, 70 billion.
Yeah, it's a huge amount. Social assistance, in contrast, was like 1% of GDP.
Yeah,
right?
okay. I didn't know
And
that part.
it's much smaller. So this is one item that Malaysia could spend more, right? And if you did an impact of on poverty, social assistance with 1% of GDP reduces poverty by 1.7 percentage point poverty level.
Okay.
Right? Fuel subsidy, 1% only.
Oh.
But it costs 3 times more.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So it's an inefficient yet expensive way to reduce poverty and inequality. Yeah. So, from that particular point of view, it's correct that the government is talking about reforming it. I know that it's a politically difficult thing, both for Malaysia and for a number of other countries that have tried to do this. But, from a purely economic perspective, it is not the most effective means for reducing poverty and inequality.
Despite the political costs that may come along with some of the structural reforms that might be done, including that of removal or phasing out the fuel subsidy, do you feel that this government must have that moral right to do it, considering that this is the right way to go when it comes to lifting up poverty? It is demanded upon them, impetus upon them to do so, and they have an answer.
Well, that's for Malaysian citizens to decide and voice their opinions about. We coming from outside, we can only offer sort of advice based on evidence that we can put together. We're not always right, but on this one, evidence seems fairly strong. That if it wants for politics, it would be best to replace something like a fuel subsidy with a more efficient mechanism, and the one that we would tend to recommend, and something that many countries have already adopted, is some form of cash transfer. And what kind of cash transfer depends on different situations as well as policy objective. But you want to make sure that if you're going to give cash assistance to families, that you want to give them enough so that they can survive, and ideally, maybe poor families can even use it to save something, so that on rainy days they have something to fall back on. There's a lot of evidence that if you give poor families cash directly, they often spend it on things like children's education, family health.
Enough research
productive
have shown
things
that across many countries,
right.
Across timelines.
Yeah.
This has been the case.
Right. Yeah. And that would allow them to also be more proactive in looking for jobs, engaging, maybe starting a little small business because they have a little bit of a reserve, right?
No, dignity. That's what we're trying to go after. It's more than economics, it's dignity.
Exactly. So, there's the effect beyond just keeping them afloat, the cash transfer.
Oh, yeah. Speaking of which, sounds like your MEM is like keeping them afloat.
Yeah.
Not so much strive.
Yeah. Well, actually, some of them can start swimming, if you do this in the right way. But so, giving each family an adequate amount is important. It's not just
is there a recommended adequate amount by the World Bank in the MEM, or I guess outside of the MEM?
Right now, the cash transfer given, and this is a little bit dated data that we had access to 2019, pre-COVID, right? The cash transfers available at the time amounted to about 11% of the income of the B10, the lowest 10%. Only 10%. So that's not a lot. An average for upper middle income countries that have good cash transfer program is in the range of 20 to 25% of the household income. So there's nothing golden about 20, 25%. It's just an average. So, further calibration can be done. Also, giving too much could make these people too complacent and maybe lazy about looking for work because they can become dependent. So we don't want to give them too much.
So how do you find that sweet spot?
Probably somewhere between 10 and 20% is the my ballpark.
Yeah.
But further, more detailed analysis can be done. And there are two ways to do this, right? Right now it's only about 10% for the poorest 10%. For the richer segment, but still B40, they're receiving less than 10% of their income equivalent in cash assistance. One is to increase the budget from 1% of GDP to 2% or whatever. well, where is that going to come from?
Yeah, exactly. If it means fuel reduction, why not?
You reduce something else and reallocate, like fuel subsidy, or collect more tax, right? Logically, those are the options, or borrow more.
Or all three, also possible.
Yes, right.
But basically fiscal, leading back to fiscal tools to alleviate poverty, which is what the whole
Correct,
mantra
yeah.
is all about.
And then another way is to take the same amount the government has allocated, 1% of GDP, and give it to only the needy, say B40. In 2019, 45% of T10 received some cash assistance from the
other
government.
55%?
Well, 45% shouldn't have received it, right? T10.
Oh, sorry.
Right? Yeah.
I thought
10%.
B10.
Yeah. B10, B40, 85%.
How did you calculate? Oh, sorry, from fuel subsidies.
This is a cash transfers, household survey
T10
data.
got cash transfers.
Yeah. So, government had a lot of different kinds of cash transfer program, cash assistance.
Okay,
45%
so efficiency of allocation is also important.
So if you tighten the eligibility to give it only to those who really need it, you can actually have much greater poverty impact.
Which falls back to my final question of the day, or for this particular conversation that we're having. The Economy Ministry is talking about Padu. I don't know whether you're familiar with it.
Yes.
This is the unit that is supposed to recalibrate using big data, trying to understand behavioral economics of how do we classify the B10, B40, M40, T20. It is outdated, trying to allocate or understand better in terms of the DI, disposable income of the household, as well as down to individual. These efforts, do you think that this is now the critical factor on us trying to understand where we stand when it comes to economic standing of the country?
Yeah, so we know about Padu. We don't know the details as to exactly how it's designed and what kind of data it's collecting.
Yeah.
But again, I think it's the right idea. Many countries have what's called social registry, which is basically a registry of households, not only those currently receiving some form of government assistance, but those who could potentially need it in the future.
Okay.
Right? In some countries, this sort of registry can cover, 60% of the population or more, right? And then it has all the characteristics necessary to identify who needs help, when.
Yes.
How many children they have, what kind of income they have, what kind of assets they have, what programs they are currently accessing, and so on. And then some of them use it to determine, okay, for this program, the primary target is, single mother with children, right? Well,
and that data can be retrieved.
Exactly, right? So, if Padu allows the government to do all that, I think it is going to be a game changer, and it's the right thing to do. Often the challenge, though, is that there are people who are excluded from these things. Remember I said 15% of B40 was not receiving
that's right.
cash assistance because they fell through a crack.
Yeah.
Right. So can Padu bring those people into the fold, in terms of the registration? And there are practical logistical challenges as to how you do it, because they're excluded because they're not easy to reach, they're not easy to identify, right? So if Padu cracks that a challenge in terms of additional data collection beyond merging existing databases within various corners of the government, then I think it can become the kind of social registry that other countries also are trying to build up.
Thank you very much. That was our conversation with Dr. Yasuhiko Matsuda, the country manager of the World Bank Group here in Malaysia. He is also the representative to Malaysia from the World Bank. If you want to learn more about this particular conversation or learn more about some of the conversations that we've had when it comes to Budget 2024, just head off to astroawani.com. Look for Belanjawan 2024 right there. My name is Ibrahim Sani. Catch you in the next one.